The story you're about to hear happened on Remembrance Day in 1990. 5 young men on 3 snowmobiles left Yellowknife in the morning to hunt caribou. The hunting party had reached Harding Lake, 50 kilometers east of Yellowknife. It's a deep lake with dangerously thin ice. That's when the unthinkable happened. The snow machine with Trevor Teed and Billy Balsillie headed out onto the lake, and suddenly they had fallen through the ice. The second and third snow machines in the hunting party followed behind and discovered their buddies in a terrifying situation. 37-year-old Trevor Teed picks up the story from there.
There was a moment of sheer panic on my part. My companion was actually quite reserved. But as I hit the water, my first thoughts ran back to my brother, who had died in a similar fashion in 1962, and my dad, who had also died in a similar fashion in 1971. And I was in my worst nightmare, and it was true. There was a couple of minutes where we attempted to get out of the water. The skidoo went right out of sight, as did our guns. We swam around and tried to grab onto ice, but the ice was too thin. It was maybe less than half an inch thick where we went through, and the ice just kept breaking and breaking and breaking. And my clothes were getting heavier and heavier, and that cold water was exhausting me rather quickly. And I was quite lucky that around that time I began to remember all the survival training I had taken a few years earlier in college, and I recalled that I should attempt to stay as still as possible and expend as little energy as possible. So my friend and I, we began to converse, and we tried to stay as still as possible, but it was very difficult because our clothes were starting to pull us down. After about 5 or 6 minutes in the water, we gave up hope. We recognized that in all likelihood we were going to die. All attempts at rescue were still a long ways away. The boys that were with us were still on solid ice about 1,000 feet away, and they had no means to reach us, or at least that we so believed. Billy and I began to talk to each other about what should happen if we got out of the water. We asked each other if he got out. I asked him to go and speak to my wife, my children, tell them I'm very sorry, that I loved them, and I apologize. And I guess I was apologizing for the risk that I had taken up at that morning, because in fact we did know there was bad ice, but we just dared ourselves to cross. And Billy told me much the same thing. It was about that time when all of a sudden I got a thought into my head that one of the guys on the ice had a sleigh that floated, because one of my past friends who just died this fall, Baby Kazan, had told me he ran a net paddling a sleigh out there, and the sleigh that he paddled was identical to the one we had on the ice. And I began to yell to the boys on the ice to use the sleigh. It floats. I was facing away from them and didn't see them. Billy related what I had said, and they heard, and they began to unhook the sleigh and try to get to us. But they were so far away that we didn't have much hope of survival. So again, we talked to each other, telling each other we were sorry for what we had done in our whole lives and how much we loved our family, and to make sure if one of us got out to deliver that message. It was about that time that I began to lose my strength and power, and I began sliding into the water downwards. I felt the water go into my ears, and I stretched out my neck as far as I could, and I still couldn't keep my chin above water. And I tried desperately to clutch the ice and pull myself up, but I had no strength. I remember my fingers sliding across the ice as I tried to grip the ice that was about a half-inch thick. And then I remember the water going over my ears, over my nose, and my hat floating off. I remember distinctly thinking that I was going to die because my hat came off and all the heat was going to escape my body. And I began to sink into the water, down, down. I remember thinking how dark it was down there. It was a kind of a huey dark. It wasn't dark as night, but it was dark with a kind of a hazy light, misty light, I guess from the ice cover. And I just continued to sink. I gave up all hope of survival at that point. And as I sunk, I began to have these thoughts run through my mind. I remembered in 1971, my dad died in the water like such. And geez, I found that very comforting. You know, I was dying just like my dad, and I thought it was great. That's a very confusing statement to make, but I really felt comforted by the fact I was dying the same way my dad did. And here, just a few minutes before that, I was very fearful. As I had that thought running through my head, I started sinking further, and then I recalled when my dad died, just how awful I had felt as a young boy, a 15-year-old boy, and how awful my brothers and sisters had felt, and my mother, and how remarkably different our life was following my dad's death. And all of a sudden, I remembered again that I was married and I had kids. And I thought, those poor kids and my poor wife, they're going to have to go through what I went through as a youth. And it hurt a lot. And I continued to sink. And then suddenly I seen this body sinking just below me. And I found it very strange that there was somebody else sinking. And I guess I initially thought it was Billy. And I looked, and I could see that his arms were bent up in front of him, sinking. His hair was floating up. And by God, it was me that I seen. I was looking at myself sinking. And I realized then that I was dying, or else I was dead. But I remember also thinking that I must be still alive because I'm still thinking. And all of a sudden I got this weird sensation. I could smell my dad. I remember hunting with him as a youth and sleeping in the same blanket, and I just remembered the scent of my dad, and I could hear people around me. I couldn't see anyone. And I desperately then tried to snap out of it and get out of the water, and nothing happened. Nothing. And it was about that point I gave up all hope of everything, and then I gave one last try at trying to save myself. I said my first prayer that I remember saying with any honesty. I said a prayer not so much for myself, but for my wife and kids. And that prayer consisted of 3 words. It said, God, save me. As soon as I thought those words, everything changed. There was suddenly a bright, 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 bright white light, the whitest light I ever saw in my life. And it was so bright, and I could look at it and I could see. It didn't blind me or anything, but it was such a white light. And again, I could smell my dad. And I had a sense my brother was near, and several other people. There was a whole crowd of people. It was as though they were welcoming me. And then I began to hear music. Not any kind of music I've heard on this earth. It was the most beautiful, comforting music I ever heard. And then I noticed, as I looked into the light, there was a figure behind the light, a long-robed figure. It looked as though that figure had long hair. I couldn't determine whether it was a man or a woman. And that person or being or whatever it be was standing with their arms open, welcoming me. And the singing and the music increased. And all of a sudden, I just felt like a baby. I felt like a baby in my mother's arms. And it was as though I was given a decision to come. And I wanted to go with the light because it was so comforting and so beautiful and so all-loving. And I had yet in my mind the thought of my wife and kids. And I wanted a chance to show them that I was a better man than I had lived up to that point. I wanted to show them that I cared. I wanted to hold them and hug them and kiss them and tell them I loved them, because I never often did that in the past. And the next thing I knew, I was shot up to the surface as though I was shot out of a gun. I came out of the water, on top of the lake, and I had strength. I had such power in me that I swam to the ice and I leaped out of the water and tried to get right onto the ice, and it broke and doubled up, and I went back again. I took a look around. I was thinking clearly. I saw where the ice had broken, and I guess one piece went down and it shot out of the water and flew up and landed on top of another piece, doubling its thickness, and I swam to that piece and I put my arm there. And I looked back to see how my partner was doing. And as I looked at him, he died. He just died, and he went down. I remember I yelled at him to let him know that I was back. I was alive still, and there was something great down there. And as I came out of the water, at the same time, that light vanished. Billy died at the instant that light disappeared from my view. And I managed to hang in there. I was told later I was underwater for close to 1 minute. I hung onto the ice, and Clem Paul paddled out to me, tied me to the sleigh, and paddled back. I was in the water for about 1 hour. It was 30 below outside. They got me, Clem and Tommy Ross. Murray Dick went for help. They pulled me out of the water. They threw me into a sleigh and drove 5 miles or so to a cabin, built a fire. There were so many little miracles that day. They lit a fire with a lighter that was frozen, covered in ice. I don't know to this day how they managed to start the fire. There was wood laid out in that cabin. There was blankets, beds. They did everything they had to do, and I survived. And I clearly recall everything that occurred. And we didn't locate Billy that day. The RCMP sent me to town by helicopter. We didn't find Billy's body. 6 days later, we went out there. During the course of those 6 days, waiting for the ice to get hard, I didn't drink or I didn't use any drugs. We found Billy's body on the 6th day, and I went back to drinking and drugging, and I stayed constantly high from November 17th, 1990 until October 26, 1991. I was high every day. I wasn't drunk every day. I wasn't right out of it every day, but I was under the influence constantly. And so much of it had to do with my struggle of why God saved me. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't find the answers, and I turned back to a life of drug and alcohol to try and explain to me what happened, or I tried to forget it. But I broke down on the 25th of October. I saw that I was growing away from my family. I was sinking lower and lower, and I was destroying the ones I loved most, and I was destroying myself. My place of employment recognized that I needed help, and they made arrangements for me to go to the detox center in Yellowknife. I had four times earlier than that been scheduled to go to a rehab center, and I chickened out each time because I had struggled in my early life from when I was a teenager until that date with alcoholism and drug addiction. And I just about didn't make it that day. I decided to quit on my own, and I made it through the day until the evening, and I started again, and I really hurt my son's feelings that night. He asked me a simple question to help him read a book, and I wouldn't read it to him because I didn't think a boy should read that book, and it hurt his feelings, and he locked himself in his room in the dark, and he was chewing on his fingernails, and he was scared of me, and that destroyed me. I went out and tied into cocaine and alcohol that night, all night long. The next morning, I knew I had to go for help, and I went. I spent a week in the detox center, and I was sent to the rehab center. And I was committed that I wanted to be there, but after about 2 weeks in the rehab, I was struggling with why God came into my life when I never, in my belief, merited his intervention into my life. And I was struggling with it. And I didn't think I could get through the rest of my life without drugs and alcohol. And I wanted to quit the rehab. And I didn't know what to do. And in desperation, I picked up the telephone and I phoned Father Duchessois, who has since passed away. And he came out and he seen me and he sat with me. And Father Duchessois had heard my story of going through the ice in some detail. A couple of days after I went through the ice, he was the first man I told. And the second person I told me I was crazy. And so I kept it into myself for a long time, that the story of meeting God, as I like to believe I did. And Father Duchessois in the rehab told me, he said, Trevor, said, when you went through the ice, you asked God into your life and he came instantly. And God's love is unconditional, he said. He says, there's no conditions to God's love. You ask him to love you, you ask him to help you, he will help you. And in desperation that evening after Father left, I went into my room. And again, I said a prayer. And again, I wasn't thinking of only Trevor. I was thinking of my family again. And I said, God, help me. And my life changed remarkably after that. I mean, instantaneous relief once again. The burden of attempting to be sober was no longer a struggle. I had a companion. I've never been a religious person. I still don't really consider myself a religious person, but I've sure got some spirituality that I never had in the past. I've been blessed with never, ever having to had returned to the life that I led in the past. I couldn't have done that without turning my will over to God. And I still don't very often go to church, but I'm in constant contact with God. And my life is so much different today. I look forward to every morning. I have my good days, I have my bad days. I'm not saying my life is perfect. I didn't sprout a halo and grow wings by any means. I'm still a human being, and I struggle through life just as the next person does. But I know I'm no longer struggling through it alone. I have a companion in God. I have a companion in my wife, my children, and the hundreds of people out there who are also attempting to live in this world through sobriety and serenity.
You've been listening to Trevor's story. Was it a miracle? Was it fate? Or was it just good luck? Whatever it was, it has forever changed Trevor Teed's life.